Welcome back, Infidels. Today we're going to take a look at what ancient Arabia was like before the advent of Islam. As always, listen to this presentation first and look over the source material first before showing it to your child. Here are pre-readings. I did struggle to find material that isn't tainted with what I like to call the jihad of speech and writing. I'll talk about that later if you don't know what that is. But I did find a couple of good sources. The first is from a Jewish website. It talks about what Saudi Arabia was like a little bit before Muhammad, and also some of the great Jewish kingdoms that were in there in the south. I don't touch on those very much because I really want to concentrate on Central Arabia, but it is a good idea to know that they were there. From Dr. Bill Warner, he wrote a wonderful book called The Life of Muhammad, the Sirah. He does touch briefly on what ancient Arabia was like right around the time when Muhammad was growing up. I just want you to focus on the first few pages. If you don't want to buy a whole book for that, he does have a podcast online that's based on this. It is several parts, but just focus on part 1 and 2. Okay, here's Saudi Arabia. We have Yemen to the south. Here's Mecca. Medina's up here. Okay, a little bit about the political structure and economics. They were very loosely organized and very tribal. They were herdsmen primarily, and they were very much into trade because Saudi Arabia is kind of sitting in the middle of the ancient world. It's between Egypt and Persia, and it's kind of in the way, so merchants have to go through it. Okay, the people that live there are often fighting over land and resources because most of the land is basically desert. Resources are very few, they're very scarce. One city, Mecca, was especially important to trade. It's like a giant truck stop and also a religious center, if you can imagine such a thing. Many different religions and cultures were present in Mecca. Even though the tribes were at war almost constantly, they would call a truce once a year for pilgrimage to the Kaaba, which is a large stone shrine in which were housed over 360 idols or gods. Okay, so here's a map of some of the trade routes. As you can see, people are going through Saudi Arabia, or ancient Arabia, to get their goods to the rest of the world. Okay. A little bit more about the culture and religion. As I said, there were Christians and Jews living in Mecca and Medina. Very few Jews in Mecca. Most of them were actually in Medina. The pre-Islamic Arabs were actually very tolerant. If you don't remember anything else from this lecture, remember this. They allowed for many different religions and systems of belief. Okay, so as long as you respected everyone's belief, you could practice any religion that you wanted. Alright, this is a really cool video. It's only a few minutes long. I'd like you to concentrate on the first half. If you want to watch the whole thing, go ahead. Just know that if you do, you're getting a little bit ahead of yourself because it goes through pre-Islamic times all the way up until the time of Muhammad. So, feel free to take a look at that because it is really neat. Alright, a little bit more about the Kaaba. Literally translated, it means cube. And in it were over 360 idols or gods. Muhammad does eventually destroy them. But before him, Allah was one of the main gods. He was a moon god. And he was considered the chief of gods there. It's contained in Mecca. And it is currently an Islamic shrine. In the Judeo-Christian belief system, Abraham casts Ishmael out and stays with Sarah and Isaac. But the Muslims believe a little differently. They believe that Abraham actually stays with Ishmael, and together they end up building this thing. There's a black stone in the side of it. Most scientists think it's a meteorite, and it was once considered Al-Uzza, or one of Allah's daughters on earth, and we'll take a look at that goddess in just a second. Okay, here's the Kaaba in modern-day Saudi Arabia. So, what they have done with the Kaaba is they've made it into an Islamic shrine. They built a huge mosque around it, and part of the Islamic or Muslim system of belief is that you have to come here once in your lifetime and do a pilgrimage, and they hold services here, and you basically do a worship service in front of this thing and bow down to it. Okay, here's Al-Uzza's black stone, and a common practice is once you've done your circumambulations and everything and done your worship service, you come over here and you kiss the stone. Okay, a little bit more about the Arabian gods. We've heard the name Allah. Another name for him was Sen. He was the chief god. And we've also studied him in the Epic of Atrahasis. Remember how I said in the Babylonian lecture that the epic, some of the oldest versions of the epic were written in Akkadian? Well, Akkadian was a language that was in pre-Islamic Arabia. So it's very, very, very likely that the Allah from the Epic of Atrahasis and the Allah from pre-Islamic Arabia were the same god. There's also Hubal or Tammuz. He was considered a warrior god by the Meccans, and he had control over rainfall. The Phoenicians called him Baal or Moloch. Okay? And there's a lot of debate over whether Allah and Hubal are the same. Some texts say they're different, some texts say they're the same. A lot of debate going on here, so we don't really know. And if they're the same, that really raises a red flag, because remember, the Phoenicians burned their children to Baal. Okay? We just covered that section, so the child sacrifice. Alright. Again, some sources say, you know, if you look at this image online, some sources say it's Hubal, some sources say it's Allah. So, a lot of debate here. And here's Allah with the crescent moon over his head, okay? Because he starts off as a moon god. Alright, we're going to take a look at some goddesses here. Okay, so in the pagan Arabian tradition, Allah is married to the sun goddess. A lot of people called her Shamash. For some reason, she's not venerated very much, but her 3 daughters are, okay? So here are these 3 ladies, a lot. Of course, she's a daughter of Allah. She had a lot of similarities to Ishtar, who was a Babylonian goddess. She's associated with Venus, the sun, and lions, like Ishtar. And she was worshipped in the form of a block of white granite. Okay, so her idol was like this white granite block. She was connected to the earth, spring, and fertility. Okay? Al-Uzza was the youngest daughter of Allah, and she was worshipped in the form of a black stone. Okay? She was worshipped in this form right here. Okay? She was very similar to Asherah because she was associated with living trees. Remember, the Phoenicians also worshipped Asherah. And archaeologists have found human remains near statues of her, so human sacrifice to her was very common. The last one is Manat. She was a goddess of death. And her name is from the word manya, meaning fate, destruction, doom, or death. She was kind of like pre-Islamic Arabian Lord Hades, if you can imagine such a thing. Okay? So here's just some pictures. This is the Temple of Allah in modern-day Iraq. I'm not sure if this is still standing. ISIS went through and razed a lot of the ancient treasures that we had over there. So I'm not really sure. If anyone knows, please let me know if it's still up or not. This is Al-Uzza's chief city. Okay, so she was the chief goddess of Petra, Jordan. If you've ever seen Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, I'm sure you've seen them going into this building. Okay, and basically statues of her are all over, and images of her are all over this. Okay. Okay, this is Manat, and she was the goddess of destruction or doom. Okay. Here's carvings of all 3 goddesses around 630 AD. Almost looks like it was done by a Roman. I'm not sure. Kind of has a Roman feel to it. Okay. In summary, We see in ancient Arabia that the Kaaba was once a pagan shrine. The three goddesses of the ancient world were daughters of Allah, and their names were Alat, Al-Uzza, and Manat. Allah was the main god, whose symbol was the moon. Allah is possibly the same as the Babylonian god Allah mentioned in the Epic of Tracius. He's also possibly the same as the Phoenician Moloch or Baal. Okay? Because these guys have child sacrifice in common. Politically, they were very loosely organized with the exception of the Jewish kingdoms in the south. And Mecca and Medina were trade hubs or major centers for trade in ancient Arabia. Trade kings ruled and tribal warfare was common. Okay, summarize the ancient world. We see from studying the ancient world that Allah is not the same as the Hebrew God Yahweh. Okay? They're not the same thing. There are connections between Allah and gods that demanded infant sacrifice. The ancient world was amazing, but in many ways cruel. And parallels exist between the ancient world and ours today. Here are my sources. I have a couple pages of them this time. It's going to be a little while before I post my next video on the Jews. Until then, Infidel on, and I wish you all a very Merry Christmas.